In 1972, director Francis Ford Coppola and star Marlon Brando gave the world a measured look into the life of a New York mafia don.
In 2021, we try a resurrected brand at Barrel Proof.
The film is The Godfather.
The whiskey is Kentucky Peerless Rye.
And we'll review them both. This is the Film and Whiskey Podcast.
Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the classic of all classics. The movie that some people would argue is the best film ever made. Brad, we held out on this one long enough. We've got to season 4 without talking about it. But today we're looking at 1972's The Godfather. Now, Brad is actually out of town this week. He's attending his brother's wedding, but he was gracious enough to join us for this episode. Brad, I am super anxious to hear what you have to say about this movie.
Yeah, Bob, this is a movie that if I had my honest opinion on which mafia movie we should have started this entire podcast with, it 100% would have been The Godfather.
Yeah, sorry about that, man. I started us out with Goodfellas thinking that would, be a nice smooth transition into a long-lasting podcast friendship, and it set us on our course, didn't it?
It sure did. It sure did.
Well, Brad, I am happy to report that we are not alone today. There is going to be somebody here to back up my Godfather might be the best movie ever made takes to combat whatever you're feeling on your end over there. And that is our friend Peggy No Stevens. I am trying to put together a short bio of how to introduce Peggy, but when you are as accomplished as Peggy is, it's darn near impossible to narrow it down or distill it down to just a few things.
Oh, I think I can do it, Bob.
Oh, please do.
The most important woman in the whiskey world.
Yeah. The godmother.
That's it. The godmother,
yeah.
if you will.
Absolutely. Peggy, how are you today?
Listen, I'm great after being called the godmother of whiskey. I could probably start my own brand.
I think you should. Yeah,
Don't
absolutely.
you think? Oh my gosh, I love it. Thank you.
So this is the second time we've had Peggy on the show. We had a fantastic interview with her, I think back in season 2, Brad. So we are overdue for another conversation with one of our absolute favorite people in the world of whiskey here. Peggy, if you wouldn't mind just kind of taking a minute and telling our listeners, some of whom may not have heard our first interview with you, just kind of all the things that you have your hands in right now. You are a very busy woman, and there's a reason we've called you the godmother. So if you can, try to enlighten us a little bit.
Well, sure. Well, especially now that the world is opening back up, and I'm so happy, fully vaccinated, ready to rock again. I really have spent a lot of time building brands in my career and have built over 32 whiskey distilleries and visitor experiences. So that's really kind of the core of my Peggy No Stevens and Associates, along with doing tasting profiles. For some of my clients, I work on packaging projects, some brands that are very well known, but I kind of am behind the scenes on those. And then also, I'm a writer for American Whiskey Magazine and a whiskey reviewer. So I do 25 blind samples, a quarter with that. And I have great fun doing that, along with writing some articles. And then, of course, Bourbon Women Association. Mm-hmm. I was the founder of the Bourbon Women Association, and we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary. I have a fabulous board that we work with, and we recently promoted Maggie Kimbrell to president. So that is going to be a wingding in 2021. We're just tickled. So those are just a few things keeping me hopping.
Well, I'm sure they certainly are, too. And Peggy, the most important question that I can ask right now, when we reached out to you to be a guest host on this season, we said, have your pick of the litter when it comes to these movies. And you immediately wrote back and said The Godfather. So the first question we have for you today, why The Godfather?
Well, I have to tell you, these are my people. These are my people. I'm Italian, if you haven't noticed, and I am so connected, still. I mean, I speak a little Italian. I still have relatives in Italy, and big fat Italian Christmas party every year with all my cousins. So watching The Godfather was, to me, almost like watching a heritage. Not that I had too many uncles that put horse heads in beds, but I have to tell you, I just related to it so much. And just the scenes of Italy and so many parts of it, and the camaraderie of family. And it just, I don't know, it just spoke to me. It just spoke to me, aside from, the cinematography. I mean, I just thought it was just fascinating how Coppola was able to capture so many just emotional scenes and the angles that he did, and just the small little details that he brought out was just fascinating to me. So I have always been just a huge fan, but I got to tell you, these are my peaks.
I am so excited to hear you already bringing up the cinematography in this movie. The whiskey nerd inside of me is already like leaping with joy. But Brad, we now have to turn the spotlight on you, sir. As most of our listeners know, Brad sometimes comes into these movies for the first time. I think I would be surprised if I find out that this was Brad's first time seeing The Godfather. But I have to ask the question, Brad, had you seen this movie prior to our podcast?
Yes, Robert, I have seen The Godfather. I had watched it once before with friend of show Mike Giles, actually.
Oh, nice. Okay. So this is your second time watching the movie. It had been a while in between viewings, or what?
Yeah, I think I had watched it like late college years, which at this point is about 8-9 years ago. So, yeah, so it's been almost a decade since I've seen it. And coming back to it with, some fresh eyes, it honestly felt really good.
Well, that means that it is time for America's favorite segment on our show, which is called Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. We are blessed beyond measure that this is not the first time that Brad has seen this movie. But Brad, as you know, we have implemented a strict 60-second time limit on Brad Explains this season. So do you think that you can squeeze the plot of this 3-hour movie down into 60 seconds for our listeners?
It'll be better than my Gone with the Wind recap, I'll tell you that. So the Godfather is about a organized crime dynasty, the Corleone family, and it follows primarily the aging head of the family, Vito Corleone, and it transitions by the end of the film to following his second or third youngest son. I don't remember which one was the youngest. Michael Corleone, who becomes the head of the family. And really, we just see them wage war against some of the other crime families, as in the 40s and 50s, they are trying to bring narcotics and drugs into the world of New York, and the Corleone family is firmly opposed to it. The Tattaglias are all about it and want to, try and bring the drugs in. And you really get to watch the inner machinations of a crime family trying to decide what's the best path forward for them as a group.
That was beautiful, man. 51 seconds.
Yeah, dude, I'm telling you, man, that it was a challenge.
Bravo.
You have this down to a science at this point, Brad.
I think the problem is how specific can you get? Because I think that's where it gets difficult. Is you can get really bogged down in the details. And I know that I left out a lot of really important things, but yeah, hopefully that was a good recap.
One of the things that I'm really glad you hit on, even in a 60-second summary here, is that when I watched this movie back this time, I think the kind of deeper meaning of the movie that came out to me was that this is a movie all about times changing. And I think multiple characters say it in this film at multiple points. It's the transition from, Vito Corleone as Don to Michael. It's transition from a more controlled gambling empire to this uncontrolled world of narcotics kind of ruling the mafia at this point. It's America kind of at a turning point after World War II. And I think what I really, really love about this movie, and we've had this happen a couple times with movies this season, Brad, is that they don't show you the Corleones at the peak of their powers or when everything was good. You get this one extended sequence of the wedding at the beginning of the movie where you have an idea of how firmly in control of everything the Don is. But then everything after that really just thrusts you into this idea that the ice is getting thinner and the ground is unstable at this point. And for the whole rest of the movie, you are watching as this family is kind of trying to regain their equilibrium. And for me at least, that was something that I guess, at younger ages or watching it prior to now, I didn't pick up on as much about how much this movie really delves into the concept of change.
Well, and the beautiful thing about how Coppola manages that is that he never actually shows any of the crimes that they commit. Like, obviously you see people get gunned down here and there, but like the actual like way that they make money through organized crime is more of a MacGuffin than anything. It's just kind of like, yeah, those are the things that they do. But the real focus of the story is how the Corleone family is handling change and how they are going about these turbulent waters of the 50s.
Well, first of all, I love how they weave in the culture of Italian life, throughout the entire film.
Mm-hmm.
You have 1 second that everybody's hugging and kissing each other and celebrating, and then the next thing, machine guns are going off,
Right.
And it just goes for this juxtaposition of there is no in between for Italian people. I mean, it's either love or hate, it seems like. But really, if you dig deeper, this kind of is an American story in a lot of ways, only in the fact that succession planning of a company, of a family business. I can't think, and I've had the pleasure of working with so many family-owned businesses in the spirits company. And, so many have sons or daughters that they want to get in the business, but they're not sure if their, son or daughter's interested in the business. And they worry about it because they want to leave it to someone and what's going to happen if they don't. I myself, my 26-year-old son has come to work for my business and I'm hoping he stays with me and I'm trying to teach him the ropes, but what if he doesn't? So it's really this succession planning of a family business and all that you go through. And if you even think about, who's going to lead, like, Al Pacino, Michael's torn because he really doesn't want to be with the family business, but he's pulled in, where Sonny, who, was played by James Caan, was all about being in the business. I mean, he was made for the business, but really didn't have the brains. He had all the brawn, but not the brains. I mean, who can't say that for any family business, when you're trying to figure out who's going to lead and who's going to take over one day and carry on the legacy. So that was really part of my take in watching everything unfold, which, by the way, I think at this point I should mention that I had a huge crush on James Caan during the whole thing. Talk about machismo, man. He machismo.
Well, maybe this is a good time to start talking about the acting performances in this movie. I mean, we've gone, I think, 10 minutes at least already, and we haven't even mentioned, the person who won the Best Actor Oscar for this movie, Marlon Brando, as Vito Corleone. I don't even know where to start. I think that's going to be the theme today. This is such a monumental movie, and it is a movie that everyone has dissected and discussed to death, that it's kind of like there's an element of it where what more can we add to it? But at the same time, like we have to talk about Marlon Brando. We have to talk about Al Pacino. Brad, why don't I throw to you? Who do you want to start with when it comes to the performances in this film?
Honestly, I think Brando is a great place to start because the movie really starts and finishes with Brando. Like, the only reason the final scene of the movie where, Michael is pretty much coronated as the new Godfather, like, the only reason that has any meaning is because of what Brando gave as a performance. Like, the ability he has to kind of have a cachet and have just command the screen at any moment that he's on it with what I would consider to be a pretty subdued performance. Like, you don't see him, as we like to say, chewing scenery,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say Marlon Brando, it just is the epitome of quiet strength. He didn't really ever have to raise his voice to get the power. He just exuded it. And like you said, he was bigger than life every time he was in a part of a scene. Your eyes were drawn to him. You knew he was the leader. And to do that without really getting emotional is pretty spectacular for an actor, I think.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that really blows me away is when you start to read about the backstory of the production of this movie. I mean, this is really Coppola's first big movie. He had done a musical in the late 60s called Finian's Rainbow, which was pretty widely panned, and it just wasn't his style. And so he finally was able to scrape the money together to make this movie, and he wanted Brando, and the studio did not want Brando. And then when they saw what Brando wanted to do with this kind of raspy voice and the lip that sticks out, and, they saw the choices Brando was making, and they were really iffy on it. And to your point, Peggy and Brad, I think the thing that blows me away about the performances in this movie is how subdued almost all of them are. And you're talking about people like Al Pacino, who at this point in his career is known for sometimes going way over the top with his performances. And you go back and watch early Pacino and, Brando in this performance especially, and subdued is the perfect word for how they're able to convey all of the complex tangle of emotions that they're all processing.
Yeah, and I think Al Pacino, he just remained conflicted the entire time. He was always conflicted. The happiest I think he was, and this is what was so interesting to me, was when he first decided to get married, moving to Italy because he was in hiding, right? His family sent him to Italy, and he met the Italian woman, Apollonia, and, he fell in love, and he was loving that life over there. He was loving it. And then he got drugged back in. He was always in conflict. Yeah. And I just thought he did a great job at finally embracing at the end, okay, I'm in charge now. I'm done with this conflict. I got to roll with it. And poor Diane Keaton, sorry about your luck, girl.
Yeah. So here's the funny thing. I started watching this movie at 8 o'clock at night in the past week. And, it gets done at 11 o'clock. And I look at the clock and I say, all right, how many hours of sleep can I get if I immediately put in Godfather 2 and watch that back to back? And so that's what I did. I watched Godfather for 6.5 hours last week. And the thing about it was great. And the thing about The Godfather 2 is, that's really Michael's story. And it is purposely set up to contrast the arc of Michael with the arc of Vito. But the thing that I really noticed this time was how well this movie sets up that arc in the second movie. Michael is conflicted, yes, but I think that, when he comes back to America after his wife is assassinated in Italy, the first time you see him, I think they tell us that he's been back for over a year and he has already kind of taken over as the head of the family because the Don is in retirement. And he's wearing all black. His expression is different. He looks pale and pallid and kind of sickly. And you can tell that there's already been this really huge change in who he is as a person. And I love looking at the little differences in the performances between Brando and Pacino, especially as the movie goes on, because you really do get the sense that even though these are two people who are, ordering hits and killing people and making money illegally, that at the core of it, Vito's doing it because he loves his family and he wants to provide for his family. And at the core of Michael, you really don't know if he does care for his own family. You get that great final shot of him closing the door on Diane Keaton so that she can't know anything about his life. And right. I think that when you kind of trace back the breadcrumbs, they do that a couple times in this movie. He closes her out of the phone booth when they call to tell him that his father's been shot. So there's always this little thread running through the movie that maybe something's up with Michael that isn't the same thing we're used to seeing with the Don.
Mike, you don't come to Las Vegas and talk to a man like Mo Green like that!
Fredo, you're my older brother, and I love you. But don't ever take sides with anyone against the family again. Ever.
I think that the key for me with Michael is that, for me, he kind of comes across as a very black and white character. That, at the start of the film, he is 100%, I am not in the family business. He's not opposed to it, and he's not condemning it. He knows about it, but he's also not going to be in it. He knows that. He's with Diane Keaton, and that's that. And then when he makes the decision to kill the police captain in Palazzo, he's 100% in. And you can tell that, he's ready to do what he needs to do. and he gets sent to Italy. And once again, he kind of flips back to his initial place of, okay, I am with Apollonia now, and I don't know if this is what Coppola was looking for, but to me, it felt like he was never going to leave. Like, it didn't matter what Vito would say. He was living in Sicily with his new wife, and that's what he was all about. And so at the end of the film, when he has turned into, the new Godfather, to me, it all comes back to Apollonia of like, when he tells him that like today is a day of, settling family debts. It wasn't just about Sonny and what they did to his father, how they kind of slowly pushed him out. Like, it wasn't any of that. It all came back to the fact that like they killed his wife, and the life that he saw for himself in Sicily, he could never get back, and he was going to make them pay.
See, I think that's interesting, Brad, because for me, the key scene is right near the end where he's talking with Carlo, who is his brother-in-law, who he has figured out basically betrayed him, that, the rival Don came and seduced him basically into whatever sort of thing he might have offered to betray Michael. And he lies to Carlo and tells him, everything's going to be fine. I'm sending you away. Your punishment is that you're banished from our family forever. And he gets Carlo outside, and as soon as he gets in the car to go to the airport, he's strangled to death. And as a viewer, as an audience member, you're like, all right, fine. Like, he can lie to Carlo because Carlo ratted him out. Like, Carlo deserves this. But then the very next scene is Connie coming in and hysterical and saying, you killed my husband. How could you do this? And Diane Keaton is asking, you have to tell me, did you do this thing? And then you see that Michael lies to her. And I think for me, that's the key to understanding Michael's character as opposed to Vito, which is like, we do a lot of really shady stuff in this family, but family is sacred and we don't lie to family. And, if you notice, like, the Don's wife, like, she knows what's up throughout the whole movie. She knows what's going on. She knows that Vito talks to her. And for Michael to treat Diane Keaton's character, Kay, the same way that he treated Carlo, I think for me, that was the key into like his psyche.
Yeah, like Michael, you're right, because Vito tried to, how do I say, be an ethical mobster? Is that the best way to put it? Because Al Pacino, he in playing Michael, he always said it was for family.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was a veil.
Yeah.
I think it was his way of just veiling violence, just to say it was for the family. I think he went to extremes where I felt like Vito Corleone was more patient and more strategic about things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and as somebody who has not seen The Godfather 2, I will fully admit, it feels like to me then that's a cool opportunity to jump into Vito's younger life and to see, was Vito as vicious as Michael, and did he kind of soften up in his old age, or are they genuinely different characters?
Well, I think that's a good point because, youth and experience are two different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So was it something that Michael was going to grow into a Vito type character?
Yeah, exactly.
Eventually. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I think this is a really good time to segue into talking about the supporting performers in this movie because there are a ton of them. Most of them got nominated for Oscars. Peggy, you've already mentioned James Caan. We're talking about Robert Duvall. I think that John Cazale as Fredo is fantastic. There's Diane Keaton as Kay. We went to Brad last time. Let's go to Peggy this time. If you had to highlight one supporting performance, who would you choose?
Well, it might be somebody that you wouldn't have thought that was lesser of a character. But of course, I already told you I'm crushing on James Caan. So he's got to vote for me.
Sure.
But Richard, and I don't know if I pronounce his last name correctly, Castellano, he played Clemenza.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember when he was making the spaghetti?
Oh, gosh.
Sauce?
He walks him through the whole process of how to make sauce. It's great.
I'm telling you, that was just so classic to me. That was just so real and authentic of they ate all the time, right? And they were always around the meal. And I just loved his character. I thought he was funny. I thought he was, almost like the glue that kind of kept the boys together, for meals and things like that. He just played a good role.
What the hell is this?
That's a Sicilian message. It means Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes.
This is one of those few movies that deal with the mafia or gangsters where the button men, the hitmen, they're not presented as really threatening people. And they clearly are. Like, we see Clemenza and all these guys do pretty despicable acts, but you really truly do get the sense that, like, when he is giving that pistol to Michael to kill the police captain and Sollozzo, and he's talking about how he's taped it so that there's no fingerprints, there's no evidence, it's just a very business-like conversation. Like, there really doesn't seem to be any personal motive in it for himself.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. It's the same person that's making a pot of sauce that, a couple scenes later is hitting a guy and then saying, leave the gun, take the cannoli. It's just, it's so matter of fact.
That was a perfect example of the line. Leave the gun, take the cannoli.
Yeah, honestly, Peggy, for me, you kind of stole my thunder there. I was really pumped about Clemenza as one of my favorite minor characters in the film. Just with the way he's able to bring humanity to the mobsters. And like you said, it's with the cannoli, it's with the spaghetti sauce. I just think he does a brilliant job at that.
I do too.
But I will say, I think one of my other favorite characters, and he's not in it for very long, is Lenny Montana as Luca Brasi. That there's something, I don't know, I heard this said once before and it's always stuck in my head. It takes someone really, really smart to play someone that is dumb. And I say that carefully, but like Luca Brasi is this character that is supposed to be this meathead who just, is the brawn behind a lot of Vito's dirty work. And yet that scene of him rehearsing what he's going to say to the Godfather and then him actually saying it to him and the way Vito responds to him, I feel like it's such an important part of the movie in setting the tone for who Vito Corleone is as a person. And I think that Montana just knocks it out of the park there.
Oh, I do too. This is what's so great about this movie. Think of all the characters that we have spoken about. It's so hard to even pick a favorite. But then, you have the top line people, like Al Pacino, Marlon Brando, which one, Robert Duvall, who do you like best? Then you have this whole secondary layer of people who were just as great. And that is why this movie was not only so content rich, but talent rich. There isn't a character that you don't remember.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it says something about a movie like this, which at its core is a pretty small, intimate family drama. Like, it seems epic because you see a lot of assassinations and things like that, but most of this movie is spent inside a house where people are talking about what's the next move because we can't go outside right now. It does not seem like a really easily marketable movie. But Brad, this was the highest grossing movie of all time for a while. We're talking about a 3-hour movie that's not named Titanic that was able to, capture the imagination of America in 1972.
Yeah, I really think that it is wild to me that this movie is what captured the public's imagination. Because in the end, you can't get away from the impact of The Godfather in popular media since 1972. Like, it's just constantly talked about. Like, you literally can't view Italian culture anymore without viewing it through the lens of The Godfather, right? That's mind-blowing to me.
Because of that culture that they conveyed. They let you on the inside of an Italian family to really understand the cultural aspects of it. And that was pretty cool.
Yeah, 100%, Peggy. The thing that I keep coming back to in this movie is the sense of family at the center of it. That, whether or not you approve of what the family is doing, they have such a core understanding of what it means to be a part of a family. And I think that's why if I had to highlight one kind of supporting performance, I would talk about Robert Duvall. I think that his character really gets to the heart of what this is about. Tom Hagen is not a blood relative of this family. He was adopted. He was taken in by Vito out of the kindness of his heart. And he spends the whole first movie and the whole second movie basically making these impassioned pleas to people, please consider me part of this family. I crave this. I want this. I want to be viewed as a son. And again, that's another person that you can contrast with Michael, who is constantly doing his own thing, who ran off and joined the army against the wishes of his father and the rest of his family. You have this character of Tom who's like, let me in. And then you have Michael who's saying, let me out.
Yeah, I think Robert Duvall really gives a masterful performance in the fact that he tries to emulate the Don in every way. Like, if I think of one other person in this movie who is reserved and powerful, it really is Robert Duvall.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's for a reason. And when you look at it, if there's a person who really should be taking over the Corleone crime family, it feels like it could be Tom Hagen, except for the fact that he's not a son. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a chance, to knock on Goodfellas. But like, it kind of feels like Scorsese just recycled a lot of the story from Godfather with some of his characters in Goodfellas.
I mean, I think he actually recycled some of the actors too, if we're being honest.
Oh, 100%.
Did you ever realize though that, Robert Duvall, he knew he wasn't really in the family.
Mm-hmm.
He was so loyal and so respectful and a can-do guy and very level-headed, but he never overreached, did he? He always knew that he really wasn't in the family.
He was a very good lawyer, and I think that he knew how to be diplomatic too in the way that he dealt with the family business. You're right. He never inserted himself.
And I wonder if that's another reason why throughout the movie, like, both Michael and Sonny say, like, look, man, you're not a wartime consigliere. Like, you don't have the balls to do what it takes here. And I wonder if they just saw that in him because, he was such a diplomatic character that they wanted somebody that was a little more brazen.
Mm-hmm.
But again,
yeah, because he was always for peace. He was always for not stirring it up.
And again, I think the thing I love about his performance is it gets back to this idea of the main characters in this movie being very restrained in how they communicate what they need to do. I love that sequence when they send him out to California and he's talking with the movie studio exec, Waltz. And he's just saying, I have one client and my client would really appreciate it if you did us this favor. He never loses his cool. Even after the guy blows up on him at dinner, he wipes his mouth with his napkin and he says, thank you very much for the nice dinner. We'll be in touch. And then you see what happens. And I think he doesn't hide behind the strength of the family, but he knows that the actions that the family is going to take will speak for themselves. He doesn't have to fly off the handle the way that Sonny does. And I really, really appreciate that this is not a movie of 20 Italians screaming at each other for 3 hours. Like, there's one character who's a hothead and everybody else knows how to work the system to get what they want.
Right.
Well, and, speaking of like all these characters that are a family, right, that this movie really, as we have said, it's all about family. Bob, you and I actually went down to the Peerless Distillery a little while ago. And I feel like the entire story that their CEO talked to us about was family. So we're going to sip on some Peerless Rye today. And guys, I'm ready to get into reviewing this. Are you?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Brad, let's get to it. All right, so today we are checking out Peerless Rye, which, Brad, it's been a couple years since we've tried this. If you're a fan of this show, then you know that way back in, I think, season 1, we took a trip to Kentucky on the hottest day of any year ever, and we dressed up nice and we sweated through our clothes and we sat in a really hot conference room and we talked with Corky Taylor, who's the CEO of this brand, about what it looked like to resurrect the Kentucky Peerless line. This was an historic brand in Kentucky. They were one of the few that I think stayed open during Prohibition with the medicinal license, and they were able to revamp it and restart it again. But what I have found out just in the last few seconds, Brad, is that our guest host today knows a heck of a lot more about this distillery than I do. So I'm going to turn it over to Peggy, who I think was one of the team leads on reviving this brand. Peggy, what can you tell us about the Kentucky Peerless experience?
Well, first of all, they are indeed one of the great families of Kentucky. Corky Taylor is a man, if you ever meet Corky, he never meets a stranger, first of all. But the man's had 9 lives. You know, he's been in everything from movies to financial stuff. Now he's into whiskey. But it's all about the family for him. And the first time I met him, if you could picture this, you know, it was before they had renovated anything in the warehouse that they're in now. And I walked in, it was absolutely freezing cold, completely dilapidated building, you know, from the 1800s or however old that building is now. And there was a card table and a chair. And his wife was in a chair and he was in a chair. And I entered the room. And it was the first time we'd met, you know, about the project. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my Lord, this is going to be a ton of work. Does this guy know really what he's getting into? And he was the most lovely person. And it dawned on me, similar to the Godfather, you know, he was checking me out. He wanted to make sure I was going to be a good fit for their family because everything was decided by the family. And so then we started the process and, you know, worked on the distillery. Of course, Caleb Kilburn, who's just brilliant master distiller. In fact, I think he's one of the brightest young master distillers coming up in the industry.
Yeah.
You know, so he was brought on. We created, you know, kind of the environment of the story, and they just had such rich content because everything was real. All their history, their family had been in whiskey many, many years ago. You know, he revived all kinds of archives. And I remember going to their home. And that was the thing about Corky. They always invited me to their home, you know, whether it would be for lunch or to see the archives, or his wife made me brownies, or, you know, I mean, they were just so hospitable. You know, the rye was about 1 year old. And he called me up and he said, Peggy, can you do me a favor? Can you come in and taste the rye? We just want to see what you think about it. It's only 1 year old, but we really want your opinion. And I was like, oh my gosh, of course, Corky, of course I'll come down. And, you know, and it was so neat to be able to walk into that finished, beautiful distillery.
Yeah.
You know, and everything's rocking, you know, bottling's going on, everything's happening. And I sat down and tasted that rye. And I remember, you know, Caleb sat on the left side of me. Corky was on the right side. You know, and I was a little nervous because, you know, I do tasting profiles all the time. But I mean, here are 2 guys that I really care about. And I was hoping that the juice would be good. And I remember tasting it, nosing. As soon as I held it to my nose for a 1 year old, I was like, wow, this is going to be something special. But I didn't want to get too excited till I tasted it. And I tasted it. And I was like, guys, you got a winner. I think you've got a winner here. I said, I know it's only a little over 1 year, but you got to watch this because you might not want it to go past 2 years. You know, this is maturing really quickly. And it was a home run. They bottled it later, you know, after it was fully matured, and it's been a huge hit. So I'm so happy for them because they really respect their history, their family, the culture that they've created for their employees, you know, everything about them, you know, just speaks of loyalty.
Well, Peggy, thank you so much for all that background. I'm excited to try this again. I remember when we sat down with Corky, he even said, you know, I love the bourbon. The rye is what we're known for. And I remember when they kind of burst on the scene, it was an immediate kind of like, all right, this brand's coming back. And oh, by the way, they're winning awards left and right for a 2-year rye, which is unheard of really in the industry. I mean, and
they won best. What did they win? Best craft brand. I think it was Whiskey Magazine or Malt Advocate.
Yeah, I think
right out the gate.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was their first, like their first real batch that they had released. And ever since then, I mean, they proudly display on their bottle, this is a 2-year rye. Their thing that they really lean into is that they do a sweet mash process. And so we've talked a little bit about that on this show. Again, most of our listeners are kind of new to the whiskey world. Most bourbons are made with a sour mash process, meaning that you kind of hold back some of that fermented grain and yeast. It's like making a sourdough bread starter, and you introduce it to the next batch. It creates a level of consistency that has really kind of been the standard in the industry for the last 100 years or more. And what they're doing at Peerless is, no, we're going to start from scratch every single time with this sweet mash process. It really does seem like, and this is not to disparage them at all, I mean this in a good way, talking with Corky, it was like they're choosing the hard way on purpose because they believe in doing things the hard way, and they think that, now they're kind of reaping the benefits of putting in all that work.
Well, I agree. I mean, sweet mash is more labor intensive. That's why so many distilleries do the sour mash process, just for consistency. So I think that Corky, he's always been one, in knowing him and his family, that he was never on a timetable. He was never on a rush to get things open. It was like, it'll be open when it's ready. So I think more and more master distillers need to think like that. The whiskey will be ready when Mother Nature says so, and not rush it. I just think it was fortunate that it was so good that they didn't have to wait, much more than 2 years, for the rye. Patience is really important. I just did a whiskey contest for Fred Minnick, and part of the categories I was tasting was five years and under, bourbons. And I could just tell so many that were just rushed into the bottle. And then I could tell the ones that were like really carefully made, even though it was 5 years old. It made a big difference. So patience is a huge thing that sometimes we lose track of in our industry, but so pays for itself at the, as the end result.
Yeah, Peggy, I 100% agree with you that, when you're willing to be patient with your whiskey, that those are the companies that really feel like they stand the test of time. However, I am not a whiskey producer. I'm a whiskey consumer, and I am impatiently staring at this beautiful copper-toned whiskey in front of me, and I'm just ready to drink it. So what are you guys picking up on the aroma here?
Well, Brad, this is a 108 proof rye whiskey. They do not disclose the mash bill. I will say that, when I get to the nose of this, there is not an overwhelming rye grain smell to it. It definitely smells a bit sweeter. It definitely smells like maybe there's a little more corn in here. And Peggy might be completely privy to the mash bill. I know I'm not. But I literally just tried another rye before we started recording tonight, and that one was a 95% rye mash bill, and it was very, very rye forward. This one hits me with lots of fruity notes up front. I get a lot of red apple on this one. And then I get some kind of classic aged bourbon-y notes on this as well. You get a great maple, a little bit of char on this. I'm really digging how sweet this rye is on the nose, Brad.
Exactly. And that sweetness to me was so distinguishable, and for it to be a rye. Because rye, like you said, traditionally, you're going to get some more spice notes and baking spices, and you're going to get, even a little dill, can come from rye.
Yep.
So what was fascinating to me when I nosed this was how it swept me with the caramel, really kind of a traditional bourbon nose in a sense. But here's where it sent me over. Have y'all ever had a Mounds bar?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's like, I got this overwhelming dark chocolate, caramel, coconut, marshmallow type nose. And that was unreal to me for a rye, to have that sweet, dark chocolate. And it was just priceless. And I love, if anybody knows me and knows what I like to drink, I always like more robust, spicier, higher proof products. I like things to punch me a little bit, on my palate. And so it achieves all of those things. It has this beautiful, luscious sweetness, and you hit it right on the maple syrup. I totally get that, and the char. But then, you taste it, and it has just the right amount of heat. It doesn't overwhelm your palate, but texturally, It's stellar. Absolutely stellar on the palate.
Yeah, as I was kind of getting into the nose, I feel like when I hover my nose just above the top of the Glencairn, I get all sorts of like banana and caramel and a little bit of like a coffee, dark chocolatey type of nose to it. The problem for me is when I kind of stick my nose down into it, I just feel like the alcohol is blasting me out of the water, and I kind of try to blow it out a little bit, and that helps some. But I will say, this is coming across to me as a very, very powerful nose from the alcohol, and I really have to keep myself like at the edge of it to get those really nice sweet notes that we're talking about.
No, I can understand that, and I think that, you know, I've described this whiskey before as power and elegance at the same time because of the proof level. And, you know, that's why I always like to nose from the side of the glass and the side of my nostril as opposed to like digging down deep, you know, with your nose in the glass, because it can overwhelm your olfactory senses.
So, Brad, if you had to quantify this out of 10, where would you fall on the nose alone?
I think I'm going to give it a 7.5 on the nose. I really like what's going on, but that power that's coming through, it does make me a little bit nervous.
Yeah, I'm actually going to fall in the same place. I'm at a 7.5. This is well above average on the nose. As you know, Brad, I love me some sweet whiskey and some sweet bourbon. And so when a rye can mimic the characteristics of my favorite kinds of bourbon, that is already like I'm salivating over here. So I'm at a 7.5. Peggy, where would you fall on this?
I'm at 8.5 for sure. Because even though the power of the proof, if you will, you know, rises to the occasion, it really is met with complexity. You know, for you to be able, like all the things that you all just said, from maple syrup to char to chocolate to this to that, you know, to get that type of complexity on a nose with that high of a proof is pretty exciting.
Absolutely.
That's complexity. Yeah.
And when I get into the flavor of this, the palate, it is, I mean, this is where the rye makes itself known for sure. It has that. It tastes like a rye. It does not taste like a 2-year rye. This does not taste like young rye grain to me.
Exactly.
And the very first thing I got on the tip of my tongue was an almost kind of saline note, and it kind of changed into like a salted caramel. So you are getting some of those great aged bourbon notes as well on the palate, but it really is kind of nicely underlaid with the rye grain.
100%. And, you know, what's interesting is how it evolves on the palate. And it evolves, you know, you have that sweet character, but that peppery, spicy, almost paprika like flavors come through. And then you nod and say, yes, this is a rye. You know, the peppery notes are coming through.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're really pointing to is that this is a complex whiskey. It's not a beginner's rye. Which, correct. You know, a lot of 2-year ryes you might expect to recommend to someone who hasn't drank many before. I don't know if Peerless would be one of them. And I think the overwhelming note for me on like the middle of my palate was pepper. Like that just gave me a blast of spice that just really rounded out those sweet notes that I started off with. And so the fact that you can start off a little bit sweet, move to a bit of pepperiness, and then finish with a lot of oak, I'm really impressed there. I'll give it an 8 out of 10 on the palate.
And you know, the thing that strikes me again is the viscosity of it. I think I may have even, you know, used this term in the past with you guys before, but you know, I love a whiskey when you can cut it with a knife and fork, because it has such great texture and viscosity.
Yep.
And you know, for those of the listeners who aren't familiar with texture or viscosity, it's how it feels texturally on your tongue. You know, when you think of like drinking water, you know, that has a certain feel on your tongue. When you think of drinking, you know, a Coke or soda, that has a certain feel on your tongue. So this, to me, literally has some volume to it. You know, it's not too slick. You know, it's not tannic. It is not astringent. It's very restful on your tongue. And that textural note is almost chewy, which I love. I love when you can find that.
That's one of my favorite notes to give on a whiskey is to say that it's chewy. And this one, you know, I don't want to call it an oily whiskey, but I would say that it reminds me of something that I would call oily in that it absolutely coats the palate. And one of my favorite things is when I can almost chart with like a geometric shape how this thing spreads out across my tongue, because it really started on the tip of my tongue, and the farther back that it went on my palate, it spread and it spread and it spread until right as I went to swallow, I felt like my entire tongue had finally, become coated with all of these various complex flavors. Brad, you were talking about the black pepper. That is absolutely the note I got right before I swallowed into the finish. I'm going to give this an 8.5 out of 10 on the palate. Peggy, what would you give it?
Well, if we can split hairs a little bit, I mean, I'd like to give it a 9. I think it's deserving, even though I don't want to be tainted by the age, because, it's shown its muscle, that it's able to hold up to the palate. So I'm going to give it a 9.
All right. And that takes us into talking about the finish. Brad, I think the finish might be where this whiskey shines even more than on the palate. I don't know if you're with me on that, but it has a nice long finish, but it doesn't, Peggy said this earlier, it doesn't turn tannic. Like, it doesn't have that sort of drying, bittering effect on your tongue. There is a fantastic Kentucky hug on the way down. It's a nice warming sensation. Yes. It packs a punch, but it remains pleasant through the entire length of the finish for me. I think I'm going to give this one, again, an 8.5 on the finish.
Yeah, I think that one of the big problems with a lot of young ryes is that I'll use the word sour. Like, that at the very end, when you're done drinking the entire glass, like 5-10 minutes later, I feel like you still have that sour, bitter flavor in your throat and on your tongue. And that's just not what I'm looking for when I drink anything, wine, whiskey, like anything at all. And so with this whiskey to be as young as it is and leave such a pleasant aftertaste, I am really impressed with it. I feel like I keep going up in score by a half point, but yeah, I'll jump to an 8.5 on the finish.
How about you, Peggy?
Oh gosh, I have to give it an 8.5 on the finish for sure.
Well, it sounds like we're all in agreement on that one. And that takes us to overall balance. Now, on this show, the way that we define balance is considering it as one kind of cohesive whole. So taking nose, taste, finish all into account as one experience. Did anything stand out above or below the rest in a positive or negative way? Or was it a consistent experience throughout? That's how we're defining balance here. And honestly, Brad, this truly was a consistent experience throughout. Just because it didn't maintain that kind of syrupy, sweet, tasting note all the way through that I had on the nose, it never surprised me or threw me a curve. If I had picked up dill on this, something would have been off after that nose. That's not there. Like, it's a nice, spicy rye, but it doesn't introduce any unwelcome flavors into it, whether it's on the palate or on the finish. I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10 on the balance, Brad.
Yeah, I'm actually right there with you. I think this is one of the best balanced whiskeys that we've had on the show in a while. Like, the entire whiskey is an experience that makes sense. Like, we'll talk about movies where the plot of the movie is like, and this happens and that happens, and you're not always sure how one thing led to another. And unfortunately, a lot of whiskeys can do that too. In this case, like, everything makes sense together. The flavors mix well together. And so, yeah, it is a extraordinarily well-balanced whiskey that I'll give a 9 out of 10 on the balance.
Yeah, I have to say I agree 100%. I absolutely give this a 9 on balance.
All right, and that takes us to our final category, which is value. Now, if you are only interested in our tasting notes, what does the juice taste like, you can consider our first 4 categories. But for most people who listen to this show, we are not willing to drop hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a bottle of BTAC that we're chasing, for instance. So we want to know that what is in the bottle is a good value, whether it's high priced or low priced. And Brad, I think this might be the only area where we kind of ding this whiskey, because it sells for $99.99. Again, it's very unique. The sweet mash process, it's really interesting. The bottle is one of, I think Corky told us, like, by weight, it's one of the heaviest bottles on the market. It is like an ornate barrel-shaped bottle. Really cool. It looks great on your shelf. But Brad, at the end of the day, even at barrel proof, even at these like micro-sized batches that they're doing, I think $100 might just be a little too high for this.
Yeah, that would be my main struggle with this whiskey. is that I feel like I have had other ryes that have been aged longer that are at a similar or lower price point. And so it's hard for me to justify spending triple digits on this whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for me, anytime you get into the $100 range, like, you're a committed buyer at that point. You know what you're getting into. You know that you're all about it. And for me, I just feel like this whiskey could be in the $60 range and wouldn't necessarily have to be costing $100.
Yeah, I think there's always a dilemma for craft distillers. I work with so many across the U.S. and, they're making it in such smaller quantity than mass produced, right? The big boys, if you will, the big boy distilleries. So the price of cost of goods and things of that nature, they just don't have that, volume. So it unfortunately raises their prices. That's why a lot of craft brands are more expensive than, the big boy brands. Not that that's helpful to a consumer. It just kind of explains why in a lot of cases. But yeah, I sure do wish, I think they would sell more, even though it's been wildly popular, and hopefully as they grow their volume, then their cost of goods would go down so they could have it at a more reasonable price. That's what I would hope in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the goal, right? Is get this whiskey into as many people's hands as possible. And I agree with you, Peggy. This is a worthy whiskey. In no way am I saying that it's not worth having. And,
right.
If you're out of, we talk about this all the time. If you're out at a whiskey bar and you can get a pour of Peerless Rye for, $6, $7, $8, go for it. It is 100% worth your time, energy, and money. But if you want to buy a $100 bottle, you're going to have to get a friend or two that also wants to try it with you. Because it's just a little bit expensive. I don't think it's horribly valued. I just think it's a little bit above what I would want. And so I think I'll give it a 4.5 out of 10 on value.
Yeah, Brad, I'm at a 4 out of 10 on value. Again, and respecting everything that Peggy said, I think we are a little bit more forgiving towards craft distillers when it comes to pricing, just because we know some of this goes into the price. But still, at $100, I think you're right. I think that there are other whiskeys that would be more appropriately priced than this. And hopefully, like Peggy said, as they continue to expand, that price will come down a little bit.
Well, how about I answer it like this? Because I find this dilemma with so many products that are on the market that, have maybe a high price tag to it. And I always describe whiskey like art. It's in the eye of the beholder, the value. And so I think each and every person, has to determine what they're willing to pay if they fall in love, with that piece of art or with that whiskey. When you think about the Pappy Van Winkles and you think about, Blanton's and some of those that are demanding, very, very high prices, why do people pay, those prices? Because some people feel that there is a value. So again, I answer it as if art is whiskey. Whiskey is art.
That's lovely. I don't think we can say it any better than that. Brad, I am coming out to a 37.5 out of 50. Now, again, I was at a 33.5 out of 40 before we did the value score. So I'm very high on what's in the bottle here. I just think that the value score kind of took it down a couple notches for me. But a 37.5 out of 50 is nothing to sneeze at. What are you coming out to?
Bob, this is the first time, and I don't know, it's been forever. We are at the exact same score.
Wow. Okay. So that'll be easy for me to average out, everybody. We are coming out to a 37.5 out of 50. Brad, we usually say that the 35 mark is where we start recommending, try it at a bar, buy a bottle. You've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but at a 75 out of 100 score, would you recommend people picking up a bottle of this?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Bob, I already kind of touched on it. If it was a black and white world and I had to give an answer, I think I would say no. If you're just buying it with your own money by yourself, I might say no. If you're willing to go in on it with some friends, yeah, grab a bottle, have a fun night, enjoy what you get. But I don't know. Is that a fair answer?
Absolutely. And I think it's like Peggy said, it's in the eye of the beholder. I would heartily recommend trying this out at a bar, deciding if this is one of those things you want to fall in love with, and then going from there. It is a darn good whiskey, and I don't think any of us are going to debate that.
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, let's put it this way. If somebody gave me a bottle of Peerless Rye, I sure wouldn't turn it down.
That is correct.
All right, so that has been Peerless Rye. Brad and I are coming out to a 75 out of 100. We'd love to hear what you think about this whiskey. But for now, it's time for all of us to get back into talking about The Godfather. What do you say?
Let's get back to it. All right, that was Kentucky Peerless Rye. We are back into talking about The Godfather, maybe the greatest film ever made. But Brad, not without its flaws, I would say. Like, this is structurally really close to being perfect. Peggy talked about the cinematography. It is immaculate. The performances are great. But even, just in the little break that we had in between recording segments here, I think we all have small nitpicks with this movie. And Peggy, I think you brought up a really important one.
Well, I noticed, of course, and again, it was probably apropos for the time period that it was shot and filmed. But if you notice, there was no female who rose to the occasion. There really wasn't. There was no female leadership. There was no female that was brought in, at a leadership level. And again, that was how it was. At that time period, women always took the back seat. They were the caretakers. They were, but a lot of times I think we forget that they were the strength behind the strong men. And so, if I had it to do over, or if I were to make a modern day, I would love to see some heroines. I would love to see, like Sofia Coppola, who later, in other Godfathers, kind of was starting to rise a little bit. So it was that kind of stuff's always hard for me to watch, but I always have to keep in mind, of course, times have changed. I mean, I can't hold on to the past, with that, because that is the way it was.
And honestly, Peggy, I'm right there with you. I think that you can look at a lot of older movies and kind of point out certain flaws that they just didn't have an eye for back then, because that was not, the culture that they were a part of. And it really, for me, it kind of makes me take a step back and look at, cinema in general and ask the question, like, at what point is it okay to crucify older movies for things that weren't considered sins back then? That they are representing reality as best as they could in 1972. And even in a certain sense, like, if somebody in 2021 was making a movie about the mafia crime families in the 40s and 50s, if you wanted to accurately represent reality, like, I'm sure that the men were chauvinistic back then, because that was just a part of the culture that they were in. So, like, how do you appropriately deal with things like that? It's a big question for our culture right now, and I don't really know the answer.
Yeah, and I don't want to compound the questions here, Brad, but I think when you look at this movie in particular, it raises almost a second question, because the movie is one step removed from the time period that it's portraying, too. Like, this is not a movie about the 1950s made in the 1950s. This movie comes out in 1972. Like, we have just gone through a cultural transformation in America, and we're starting to have these conversations about women's lib, and feminism is, like, at its zenith right now in 1972. And so you have to ask the question, with this kind of topic on the brain of America, is Coppola
accurate to the time period, which is this was the 50s. Women weren't allowed to speak up in some ways, especially in this environment. Or is he consciously making a decision to leave the female characters on the back burner? And I think that it raises almost a second issue because it's dealing with a different time period than the one that it was made in.
Yeah, I think I would have to believe that he was just focused on the time period and not purposely leaving, I mean, my gosh, you had Diane Keaton, which at the time she was a rising star, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now she'd be a headliner. But I think, he had a ton of talent, that he was dealing with. So I would like to think that he was just really focused on the time period of how it probably was at that time period.
Well, it's also fascinating to me that you really have a clash of old Hollywood and new Hollywood, with Marlon Brando being like the elder statesman of the bunch, with a lot of really young up-and-coming actors like, Duvall and Pacino and the likes. And so I wonder if there's even kind of a bit of a conflict there of like, Marlon Brando is probably used to the world where he is the main character, period, end of story. There's no chance of a woman taking the spotlight from him.
I mean, I think that might be true to some extent, Brad, but we've talked a lot on this podcast about how Brando really was like the turning point in Hollywood, from old Hollywood to new Hollywood. He was the first one to really break through from the actor's studio in New York. He was into method acting. All of the old classic Hollywood actors hated him because they thought he was a weirdo, And here he is in The Godfather. He's only in his mid-40s when he makes this movie, and they make him up to look, 20, 25 years older. So, I mean, there is an extent to which, yeah, he's kind of the elder statesman here, but I don't know if I would go so far as to kind of like attribute all of those things that we associate with old Hollywood to Brando. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. No, it 100% does. I guess, to get back to the really big question is, at what point do we say, it's okay for an older movie to not be, quote unquote woke? At what point do we just say, it is good for what it was, and there are certain parts of it that we don't like in our modern culture, but we're okay with that? I don't know. Is this a movie that you can do that with?
I mean, I think you always have to keep that in mind when you're watching something. I mean, it's a cultural artifact. It's a product of its time, and it's depicting a time that came even before then. And I honestly think, Brad, that if I was able to sit down with 10 years ago me, I would probably say something that the current me wouldn't like. And I think that people change and people evolve, and our ways of thinking as a culture have evolved and hopefully gotten better in some ways. And I think that when you are in a position like the position we're in now, where we just know more and we want to do better, that part of that doing better is also being a little bit forgiving to where we might have had it wrong before.
Yeah. And I got to say, I think we're learning all the time, right? We're learning every day, and not to look to the past so much as to look into the future of how future movies will be made. I find it fascinating to see where and what direction we will head. And so I'm very interested in looking to the future.
Well, before we can really look to the future, I think it might be time to kind of wrap up where we feel on The Godfather. I think I might as well just start us off because I know I'll be in the minority. I texted Bob right after I finished watching this movie, and I told him, I was like, when I finished watching Citizen Kane for the first time, I was like, I get it. I see why people could consider this the greatest movie of all time. And I just don't get that feeling with The Godfather. It's a phenomenal movie. I think it is really impressively made. I like the characters. I like the story. For me, it is paced a little bit slowly. It just kind of drags through the life of this family in such a way that I want there to be more going on from time to time. On top of that, there's other small issues throughout the film. But like I said, there's small issues. I really love this film. I guess the reason I went first is I want to let you guys, take to the soapbox and tell me, why is this the greatest movie of all time? Because for me, I'm coming out to a 9 out of 10. Phenomenal, great movie. I would watch it again in my lifetime, but I don't get the greatest of all time hype.
I mean, Brad, I think when you get to that point, you're just kind of talking about degrees of how much I love this thing. And, when you look at IMDb, I think this is the number 2 highest ranked movie ever behind Shawshank. And it has a 9.1, I believe, out of 10 on average from, 1 million plus people voting on it. And I think for a movie to come out to an average of a 9 for over 1 million people really says something about what we think of the quality of it. And honestly, Brad, I'm not going to really debate you on this because I think your take is completely valid. Like, everyone recognizes The Godfather is a well-made movie. The Godfather is an important movie. And I think you get a sense watching it. You can feel the importance of it as you watch it. And I think for some people, it's like a perfect movie. And for some people, it's a really, really great movie that may not, it might not be in your top 10 of all time. And that's okay because we're still kind of coming out in the same place on it. For me, this is absolutely, if not top 10, it's top 20 all time for me. And I'm 100% going to give this a 10 out of 10. But I think Peggy might have an even more kind of personal connection and love for this movie than I do. So I'm interested to hear what she has to say.
Well, first things first, you two are the pros at reviewing movies. Okay. All I know is I might have a very different metric for how I review movies, because of course, The Godfather hits it for me on the cinematography, on the character building, the diversity of the characters, how they're intertwined, the cultural aspect of Italians and the family and what that means, that touches me. But what I always judge a great movie is how it makes me feel. And when I watch The Godfather, I'm swept. I am swept into their world and I'm taken away. And isn't that what we want movies to do? Right? Is to take us out of the day to day of our real life and kind of put us into, you're so entertained and you're so enthralled that you almost forget, the real world until the movie's over. And then you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, here we go. So it swept me. And I think that's why I enjoyed it so much because I wanted to pay attention to every detail. I wanted to understand, the details of the plot. And I wanted to fall in love with the characters, which I did. I absolutely fell in love with the characters. So my biggest metric is the way that a movie takes me away.
Peggy, I am going to dig my heels in on this one. You got to give it a score out of 10. Where are you falling?
Oh my gosh, 9.5.
There it is. Splitting the difference. Very diplomatic. Very Tom Hagen of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's where we're all coming out on The Godfather. Brad's at a 9. I'm at a 10. Our guest host, Peggy No Stevens, is at a 9.5. But we want to know what you think. Brad, I think most of our viewers will have seen The Godfather. If not, watch it and get back to us. Let us know what you think. Where are you falling on your final score for The Godfather? You can find us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you can give us a phone call. Let your voice be heard on the Film and Whiskey podcast. You can leave us a voicemail on our website, which is anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
Once again, we want to say thank you to our guest host, Peggy No Stevens. You came in here and made us look good, being the true professional that you are. It is always a joy to talk to you, Peggy.
Listen, this was tons of fun. I just, as you know, when you all asked me and I chose The Godfather, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be so much fun to talk to these pros on movies. And, I just had a ton of fun with it. So thank you always for thinking of me.
Well, Peggy, we are going to let you go here in a minute because I know you have Derby prep to get ready for here.
Big time Derby prep.
Is there anything coming down the pike here for Bourbon Women, for Peggy No Stevens and Associates that you'd like to take a moment and plug?
Gosh, I absolutely would. Bourbon Women Association, we have made the decision. We are doing our annual Bourbon Women Symposium. Yes, that's SIP, Symposium. We usually have about 300 women come in for an entire weekend in Louisville, Kentucky. And our dates are August 27th through the 29th. So just go to the bourbonwomen.org website and we'll have information on that starting next week. And then the real announcement is that Bourbon Women is starting our own membership club for bottles. And so we are doing this according to a women's palate. We're having experts like myself and Susan Riegler and others that are on and part of our membership. And we're gathering women from distilleries and going to different distilleries and hand selecting barrel picks to have them bottled and sold specifically to a woman's taste.
Every time we talk to Peggy, she has new and exciting things, and I'm absolutely blown away. I cannot wait to hear more about that program. As far as we go, we will be back next Monday talking about the 1975 comedy classic, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So stay tuned for that one. For the Film and Whiskey Podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.